A locked door in a small North Carolina building, 1980-something. Inside is a converted teacherage, the same boarding house where a barefoot little girl once ran the halls, collecting the affection of 6 schoolteachers who were not her mother. Now it is a museum, built in her honor, filled with her gowns, her love letters, her studio portraits. She is standing outside it. Someone offers to find the key. She says no. She already knows what is inside. She lived it. Contrast that with this. 2 decades earlier, a ballroom in Nairobi. A film crew flown in from 3 continents. A woman so photographed that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's own publicity department called her studio home to more stars than there are in the heavens, and she was, by every account, the brightest one in the building. So how does the daughter of a tenant farmer, born in a town so small it was never on a map, become one of the most photographed women alive, and then, near the end of her life, refuse to walk through the door of her own museum? In the next few minutes, you will learn about a telegram sent by a studio chief who thought she couldn't act, couldn't talk, and would be a star anyway. You will learn what really happened the year her 3rd husband fired a gun into a mattress in the room next to hers. And you will learn why the one book that might have told her story honestly, the one she finally agreed to tell, never got written while she was alive to see it. What you are about to hear is not a story about a Hollywood beauty. It is a story about a woman who spent her whole life being described by other people, and who ran out of time before she could describe herself. There is a detail buried in all of this. A locked door, a museum, a woman who didn't need to look inside. Remember it. We are going to come back to it, and by the end, you will understand exactly why she said what she said. Stay with this one. It has not been told this way before. She was born on Christmas Eve, 1922, in a crossroads community in Johnston County, North Carolina. So small and so informal that most maps never bothered to record its name. Locals called it Grabtown, supposedly because when peddlers rolled through with wagons of goods, people grabbed for what they wanted before it was gone. It is as good a metaphor as any for what would come later in her life. Her parents, Jonas and Molly Gardner, were not poor in the way people assume. Jonas held the deed to a working tobacco and cotton farm. He owned a sawmill. He owned a store. By the standards of rural Johnston County in 1922, the Gardners were doing better than most of their neighbors, even without electricity, even without indoor plumbing, even with 7 children crowded into one farmhouse. She was the last of them, the baby, and by her sister's later accounts, thoroughly spoiled and thoroughly wild. She went barefoot every chance she got. She climbed the water tower behind the schoolhouse just to see if she could. She had a friend, a black boy who worked beside her in the tobacco fields, and she would not tolerate anyone who tried to treat him as less than her equal, an instinct that, decades later, would put her in nightclubs that did not allow black patrons, with a black woman on her arm, who by then was closer to her than family. Then, in 1925, when she was not yet 3 years old, fire took the barn and the cotton gin. The Gardners could not rebuild. Jonas Gardner, a man who had once owned the ground under his family's feet, became a caretaker at a boarding house for schoolteachers. Molly cooked the meals. The family that had briefly stood a rung above their neighbors now stood exactly where everyone else did, dependent, month to month, on someone else's institution staying open. It stayed open for 9 years. Then the Depression closed it, and the Gardners moved again, this time to Virginia. Jonas's health had already begun to fail. In 1938, in Newport News, he died of bronchitis at 59 years old. She was 15. Here is the detail she carried the rest of her life, one she repeated in her own words decades later. In his final days, she went to the minister who had baptized her and begged him to visit her dying father, to give him some comfort, some blessing. The minister never came. Nobody wanted to know Daddy when he was dying, she said. He was so alone. She said she had no time for religion after that. A farm burned, a father unvisited at the end, a 1/10 of an inch decision by a stranger with a camera, still years away. The seed of everything that came next, the need to be wanted, the suspicion that the people who claimed to care wouldn't show up when it mattered, was already planted before she ever set foot in front of a movie camera. By 1940, the family had settled in Rock Ridge, North Carolina, and the 18-year-old orphaned farm girl was studying to become a secretary. That was the plan. Hollywood was not. The plan changed because of a photograph she never asked to be taken. In the summer of 1940, she visited her older sister in New York City. Her brother-in-law, a professional photographer, took her portrait as a gift for their mother and liked the result enough to display it in the front window of his Fifth Avenue studio. A legal clerk who worked for the company that owned Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's parent theatre chain spotted it, tried to charm his way to her name, got turned away by the receptionist, and told the studio to look at the girl in the window anyway. She was interviewed at MGM's New York office. The man conducting the test had her walk toward the camera, turn, walk away, and rearrange some flowers. He never recorded her voice. Her North Carolina accent was so thick he couldn't follow a word she said. It was, by design, a completely silent screen test. Studio chief Louis B. Mayer reportedly sent back a telegram that would follow her for the rest of her career. She can't act. She can't talk. She's terrific. She signed the contract. She left college. She boarded a train for Hollywood with her mother watching over her, worried the whole way that this opportunity might swallow her daughter whole. It nearly did. Just not yet. MGM's finishing process was total. Diction coaches, a singing teacher named Harriet Lee, wardrobe, posture, walk. Everything adjusted to fit a studio ideal. Everything except her face, which needed no adjustment at all. She spent the next several years in uncredited walk-ons and bit parts, 15 of them before she got her first billed role, playing a supporting part in the low-budget horror comedy Ghosts on the Loose in 1943. At 19, she married MGM's biggest star, Mickey Rooney, 20 years old, already twice as famous as she was, and immediately smitten the moment he saw her on set. He asked for her number. She said no. He asked again. She gave it to him on the condition, her older sister advised, that he work for it. He did. They married in the small town of Ballard, California, in January 1942, a location chosen specifically because studio executives feared that a public wedding would shatter Rooney's wholesome, small-town Andy Hardy screen image with his fans. Within a single year, a girl who had been anonymous in a farmhouse, without indoor plumbing, was married to one of the most famous men on the planet. Everything her family back in Johnston County could have imagined for her, and more. But underneath the wedding photographs, something was already wrong. She had married expecting a version of her own parents' marriage. Quiet nights, home cooking, loyalty. What she got instead was a husband who wanted nightclubs, attention, and other women's phone numbers. Within 18 months, the marriage would end, and that ending would arrive on the very same day as a second, much larger loss. We will get to both. First, you need to understand what was happening to her, privately, underneath the studio machine that built her. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about Ava Gardner. The woman audiences believed they were watching on screen was rarely the woman living the life behind it. MGM did not merely manage careers, it manufactured personalities, and it demanded that its stars perform those personalities off-camera as diligently as on. She sat for endless cheesecake photo sessions, leg shots, bathing suit poses, staged glamour stills designed to sell a fantasy of confident, effortless sensuality. She cooperated because cooperation was the unspoken cost of the contract. Privately, she had almost no faith in her own talent. People who worked alongside her in this period would later say she never once believed she was a good actress, an opinion no praise from directors, critics, or co-stars ever seemed to change. There was a widening gap, then, between the studio's manufactured Ava Gardner, glamorous, in-demand, endlessly photographed, and the private one, who felt like an imposter in her own skin and increasingly used alcohol to get through it. She would later admit that walking into a crowded room filled her with such dread that she wanted to crawl beneath the carpet just to get to the other side unnoticed. A glass of champagne, or something stronger, became the tool that let her function inside a persona she never fully believed she deserved. This is the piece of evidence that survives from the period, buried inside her own later account of her life. She said the studio system did everything to her, except perform surgery, remade nearly every visible part of her, and the unintended side effect was to make her feel there was something fundamentally wrong with the real her underneath it. Her mother, meanwhile, did not know how bad the marriage to Rooney had already become behind closed doors. To the public, and largely to her own family, the marriage still looked photogenic. Privately, she had grown convinced Rooney was unfaithful, and she had begun quietly gathering the resolve to end it. A resolve she would act on faster than anyone in Hollywood expected from a 19-year-old newlywed. The hidden life was not an affair, not yet. It was something smaller and, in its way, more corrosive. A widening private conviction that she was a fraud, wearing another woman's face, propped up by a studio that had built her image and now owned it. She would spend the rest of her career trying to close that gap between the woman on the poster and the woman who felt, underneath the makeup, like a farm girl who had wandered into someone else's story. That gap was about to widen further. Within the year, she would lose her marriage and the person who had shaped her entire moral compass on the same day. 1943. Her marriage to Mickey Rooney, less than 2 years old, was collapsing under the weight of his gambling and his wandering eye. She filed for divorce. The decree came through on a specific day in 1943, and on that same day, her mother, Molly Gardner, died of cancer. Picture it plainly. A 20-year-old woman, already unraveling from the failure of a marriage she'd entered in good faith, receiving legal confirmation of that failure in the very same hours she lost the one person who had been her moral center since Grabtown. Her mother had been, by her own later description, her rock through every uprooting the family endured: the fire, the depression, the death of her father, the disorienting collision with Hollywood. Now that rock was gone, on the day her marriage officially ended. You need to sit with what that means. Not a tragic anecdote to be recited and moved past. An actual convergence, a single calendar date carrying 2 irreversible endings at once, for a woman not yet old enough, by today's standards, to legally rent a car. She did not collapse publicly. There is no record of her missing a call time, no headline about a breakdown. What the record shows instead is something quieter and arguably more revealing. She began drinking more deliberately, using it the way she'd already started to, as a tool to survive rooms she did not feel she belonged in. And she began, from this point on, describing herself to interviewers and friends alike in terms that undercut her own achievements before anyone else could. She knew what she was, she'd say, years later, and what she was not. There is a detail from this period worth holding on to, because it will not make sense until much later in this story. Even as her personal life fractured, MGM was quietly beginning to see her differently, not as a contract extra to be filled in around bigger stars, but as someone whose face alone might be worth building a picture around. The mechanism that would make her famous, and the mechanism that was breaking her down privately, were, at this exact moment, running on parallel tracks, and neither one was slowing down for the other. What did losing her mother, on the day her marriage ended, actually cost her going forward? You will see the answer play out for the rest of this story, in the men she chose next, in the drinking that would follow her for decades, in the family of her own she would spend years wanting and ultimately never have. She did not talk about 1943 often. When she did, she talked about her mother first, and the divorce almost as an afterthought. That should tell you something about where the wound actually was. Here is what no biography built entirely from studio press releases has ever fully explained. In the years immediately following her mother's death, Ava Gardner was privately reconstructing herself from scratch, without a script, while the cameras kept rolling on someone the public believed was thriving. She married again in 1945 to bandleader Artie Shaw, a man 14 years older, already 4 times married, a self-styled intellectual who treated her, by her own account, as a promising but unfinished project. He assigned her reading. He pushed philosophy and literature at her, the way a professor pushes a struggling student. And rather than feeling encouraged, she felt small, reminded again that she was not enough as she already was. When he found her reading a popular bestseller instead of Schopenhauer, he reportedly threw the book across the room in disgust. The marriage lasted barely a year. The postscript is almost too clean to be true. After divorcing her, Shaw went on to marry the very author of the novel he'd once hurled across the floor. What the household staff and her closest friends began to notice in this period was a woman building, quietly, a private support system entirely separate from her husband's. The men kept failing her, one after another, but the people she hired into her life were starting to stay. In 1947, a young woman named Mickey Rooney Jordan interviewed to become her housekeeper. Within one conversation about how to properly mix a martini, the two became inseparable. Jordan would remain in her life, as friend and confidant, for the rest of it. Longer, in the end, than any husband managed. This is the pattern that was forming, invisible from the outside, a woman whose romantic choices kept collapsing into disappointment, quietly assembling a smaller, steadier circle of people who did not require her to perform. It would happen again with directors, with a small number of loyal friends, and, much later, with a movie star who would take in both her housekeeper and her dog after she died. None of this made the fan magazines. What made the fan magazines was her breakout performance that same year in a moody film noir called The Killers, playing a femme fatale so magnetic that audiences and critics alike stopped seeing her as a contract extra and started seeing a star. It was, by her own later admission, the first film role she actually enjoyed making. The public was watching a woman arrive. Underneath it, a woman who had lost her mother, divorced twice before turning 25, and built her actual support system out of a housekeeper and a handful of quiet friendships, was still trying to figure out who she was when nobody was filming. By 1949, 26-year-old Ava Gardner was twice divorced, newly famous, and about to walk into the relationship that would define the rest of her life, and very nearly end it. She had known Frank Sinatra since her marriage to Rooney, but in 1949, their paths crossed again under very different circumstances. Sinatra's career had cratered. He could barely book a nightclub date. He was married to Nancy, his wife of over a decade and the mother of his children, and simultaneously carrying on an affair with Ava's own friend, actress Lana Turner. Into this triangle stepped Ava, and what followed was, by every account, less a romance than a collision. This was not the first time she had loved a famous, complicated man, but it was different in one specific way. This time, the public did not merely gossip. They mobilized. When she and Sinatra were photographed together at a Houston nightclub, while he was still legally married, the backlash reached her directly, in the form of hate mail, branding her a homewrecker, letters sent not to a studio publicity department, but to her. Sinatra finally divorced Nancy in 1951. He and Ava married the same year. By every surface measure, this should have been her happy ending. The love, by her own later description in her memoirs, of her life, finally hers without complication. It was not. The marriage was defined almost immediately by a jealousy so mutual and so combustible that friends compared it to two sticks of dynamite standing next to each other, waiting for a spark. During her years with Sinatra, she became pregnant twice. Both times citing MGM's unofficial penalties against stars having children and her own uncertainty about the timing, she chose to end the pregnancy. A decision she made largely on her own, and one that devastated Sinatra when he learned of it after the fact. The public saw a Hollywood power couple attending premieres. The private record, pieced together decades later from her own account and from those close to both of them, shows something closer to open warfare. Accusations of infidelity on both sides. A night when Sinatra, in a rage, fired a gunshot into the mattress in the room beside hers, specifically to frighten her, and a jealous ex-suitor, the reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes, quietly paying detectives to follow Sinatra and hand the surveillance photographs directly to Ava. She made a decision, in the middle of all this, that the viewer watching now already understands was a mistake before she did. She used her own considerable influence in Hollywood to help get Sinatra a role that would revive his entire career. That decision would save him. It would not save them. The role Ava Gardner helped secure for Frank Sinatra was the supporting part in the 1953 war drama From Here to Eternity. He got the role. He won the Academy Award. His career, which had been effectively dead 2 years earlier, came roaring back to life almost overnight. His resurrection became the final weight that broke their marriage. The scandal was never really the affair that had launched them. By 1953, the public had mostly absorbed that story. The real scandal, the one gossip columnists Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons kept circling without ever quite naming outright, was that two enormously famous, enormously jealous people had built a marriage almost entirely on possessiveness, and that possessiveness did not soften once one of them succeeded. It curdled. His career revival meant more travel, more premieres, more people looking at him, and in a marriage defined by mutual suspicion, more looking meant more fighting. Publicly, they still arrived at events together, still smiled for photographers, still gave interviews about a marriage that, by their own later private accounts, had already become nearly unlivable behind closed doors. Privately, the fights had become a fixture, jealous rages over imagined slights, over who looked at whom across a room, over surveillance photographs that Howard Hughes kept supplying. By 1953, less than 2 years after the wedding that had scandalized half of Hollywood, Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra announced their separation. The divorce was finalized in 1957. What the press was mocking, in the years leading up to that separation, was never actually the real secret. The real secret was that the marriage everyone assumed was the love story of the decade had, from very early on, been sustaining itself on the same jealousy and mutual damage that had ended both of her previous marriages. Just with higher stakes and a much bigger audience watching it happen. And yet something about this one refused to end cleanly. Unlike Rooney, unlike Shaw, Sinatra never fully left her life. She would say, decades later, that he was the love of her life, and by his own account to friends, he felt the same about her, even while acknowledging that he would always love Nancy because she was the mother of his children. They remained, against every reasonable expectation left over from the scandal years, genuinely close for the rest of her life. A friendship that would matter enormously and unexpectedly in the final chapter of this story. For now, in 1953, 30-year-old Ava Gardner did what she would keep doing for the rest of her life whenever a chapter closed badly. She left the country. She went to Rome first, to film The Barefoot Contessa, a role she took partly because the character, like her, preferred to go without shoes, a detail so small it reads almost like a joke, except that it was one of the only pieces of herself she insisted on bringing intact into a fictional character. Then, in 1955, she moved to Madrid and stayed in Spain for over a decade. She took almost nothing of her old Hollywood self with her, except her passport and her housekeeper. What she built instead, in Spain, was a life almost defiantly opposite to the manufactured glamour MGM had spent a decade constructing around her. She drank in the lowest bars she could find, sat up all night in flamenco clubs, spent 2 full nights sleeping in a cave with a group of gypsies she'd met in the mountains, simply because she didn't want the night to end. Friends who visited described a woman who came alive after dark, in a way Hollywood premieres had never allowed. The children in her life during this period were not her own. She had none, but she went out of her way to make time for the children of the people around her, in a way that hints at exactly what she had wanted and been denied. A friend's 12-year-old daughter, once, was simply invited along to the movies on a whim, picked up by car at 7 that evening. No fanfare, no publicity. The girl, decades later, still remembered being in heaven. What she produced during her Spanish exile was, in its own way, some of her most confident screen work. Away from Hollywood, away from the studio machinery that had once told her she wasn't good enough to dub her own singing voice, she began to relax into roles that suited a woman who had actually lived. Worldly women. Women who understood exactly what life cost, played by an actress who by now understood it too. She also embarked on a torrid affair with the celebrated Spanish bullfighter Luis Miguel Dominguín and deepened a long friendship with novelist Ernest Hemingway, who was delighted when she was cast as Lady Brett Ashley in the 1957 film of his novel The Sun Also Rises, a role built, almost too neatly, around a woman defined by drinking, bullfights, and a string of men who could never quite hold her. Remember the silent screen test from Section 2, the one where a studio executive couldn't understand a word she said, and Louis B. Mayer sent that telegram anyway? Here is the first payoff of that thread. The woman who couldn't act, couldn't talk, and was terrific anyway had, by her 40s, become an actress whose confidence only grew the further she got from the system that made her famous. Spain gave her distance from Sinatra. It could not give her distance from herself. That reckoning was still coming, and it would arrive through a man far more dangerous than any bullfighter. In 1966, director John Huston cast 42-year-old Ava Gardner as Sarah, wife of Abraham, in the sprawling Dino De Laurentiis production The Bible in the Beginning. Her co-star, playing Abraham, was actor George C. Scott, a brilliant, volatile man in his late 30s, already known in the industry for a temper as formidable as his talent. During production, the two became lovers. What followed, according to Ava's own later account, and to people who worked with both of them, was not a romance so much as a sustained act of violence dressed up as passion. Both were heavy drinkers. Both had tempers capable of frightening people who'd seen plenty in this industry already. John Huston himself reportedly warned her directly to be careful, that he believed the man was, in Huston's word, a killer. The physical toll was specific and documented. Scott broke her shoulder. He injured her ribs and her back badly enough that she spent much of the remaining production wearing a body brace beneath her costume, continuing to shoot scenes as the biblical matriarch Sarah while nursing injuries inflicted by her own co-star off-camera. On at least one occasion, according to her housekeeper Renee Jordan's later recollection, Scott convinced her to travel with him to Connecticut, and when no one had heard from her for hours, Jordan grew hysterical enough to call the one person she trusted to intervene, Frank Sinatra, her ex-husband, still, somehow, the man she turned to in a genuine emergency. Sinatra told her not to worry, that he would handle it. Roughly 2.5 hours later, someone retrieved Ava and brought her home, beaten and bruised badly enough that, in Jordan's words, it was terrible to see. What did this relationship cost her? Physically, an injury severe enough to require a body brace on a major studio production. Professionally, nothing. The film was released, and she completed the role. But psychologically, the encounter with Scott sits as one of the darkest data points in a lifelong pattern. A woman repeatedly drawn to enormous, damaged talent, repeatedly finding herself on the losing end of that talent's worst instincts, and repeatedly turning, not to police, not to the press, but to the one ex-husband whose loyalty had somehow survived their own scandal-soaked marriage. It is worth sitting with the fact that the same year she was being physically brutalized on a biblical epic about faith and covenant, she was also finally moving permanently to London, closing the Spanish chapter of her life for good, and undergoing an elective hysterectomy, a preventative measure taken specifically out of fear of the uterine cancer that had killed her own mother 23 years earlier. One relationship nearly cost her her life. One medical decision was an attempt to outrun the disease that had already taken the person she loved most. Ava Gardner never had children. The 2 pregnancies she ended during her marriage to Sinatra were, by her own account, the closest she came, and by every account from people who knew her, the ache of that absence never fully left her. She adored other people's children on sight, was famous among friends for getting down on the floor to play games with any baby placed in front of her, and later in life referred to her dogs, without irony, as her babies. It was not the family she had wanted. It was the family she was left with. So consider instead what happened to the people who did share her life closely, because their fates tell you almost as much about the cost of loving her as a biological family tree would. Mickey Rooney, husband number 1. He went on to marry 6 more times after Ava, built a decades-long career as a beloved character actor, and lived into his 90s. A survivor, by any measure, though he would say publicly years later that he was sure they had both simply tried their best and it hadn't worked. Artie Shaw, husband number 2. He divorced her in 1946, married the author of the very novel he'd once thrown across a room in disgust, and continued marrying, 8 wives in total across his lifetime, before largely retreating from public life to write and reflect. Frank Sinatra, husband number 3. He never fully let her go, and she never fully let him go either. He remained, by every account on both sides, the great love of her life, and she of his, right up until the specialist flight he arranged and paid for near the very end. Maureen Reaney Jordan, her housekeeper and closest confidant for over 4 decades. She stayed until the end, and after Ava's death, actor Gregory Peck, her longtime friend and 3-time co-star, personally took her in, along with Ava's dog, honoring a friendship that had outlasted every marriage Ava ever had. This is the generational pattern, made explicit. A woman raised by a mother who was, by her own description, her rock through every hardship, who then spent her adult life searching for that same steadying presence in a series of husbands who could not provide it, and finding it instead, unexpectedly, in a housekeeper hired to mix martinis and a director's leading man who simply refused to stop being her friend. Remember the 2 abortions mentioned earlier, kept out of the public record for decades, disclosed only in the memoir published after her death? Here is what they mean, examined plainly. A woman who wanted a family more than almost anything else she has ever been quoted wanting, making an irreversible decision twice, under studio pressure and marital chaos, and living the rest of her life without the thing she'd wanted most. She built a family anyway. It just didn't look like the one she'd planned for as a teenager, dreaming of motherhood back in Rock Ridge. By the mid-1970s, Ava Gardner was working almost exclusively for money, not ambition. Good roles for women past 50 were scarce in the industry that had built its identity on her youth and beauty, and she knew it. She took disaster films like Earthquake, took supporting parts in pictures she privately dismissed, in her own blunt phrase, as work she did strictly for the loot. She was not chasing prestige anymore. She was paying bills. She had settled by then mostly in London, at a flat at 34 Ennismore Gardens in Knightsbridge, occasionally returning to North Carolina to see family, kicking off her shoes the moment she got home, the way she had as a barefoot child in Grabtown. When a relative once asked how it felt to be so rich and famous, she laughed the question off entirely. "Just an old broad who gets her picture taken a lot," she said. The financial reality was more complicated than the joke suggested. Decades of film work, 3 divorces, and a lifestyle built on drinking, travel, and generosity toward the people around her had left her without the kind of fortress fortune her fame might have suggested to an outsider. She was comfortable, not secure, and that distinction would matter a great deal within a few years. In 1985, at 62 years old, she took a guest arc on the primetime soap opera Knots Landing and was, by the cast's own account, an immediate hit. Likeable, professional, entirely without the diva reputation her tabloid decades might have predicted. Producers begged her to make the role permanent. She turned them down. She had no idea, she admitted, that television actors worked that hard, and at 62, she simply didn't want to. She agreed instead to one more project, a television pilot called Maggie, alongside her friend Stephanie Powers. It would be, though no one knew it at the time, the last performance of her career. Shortly after filming Wrapped, Ava Gardner suffered a stroke. It cost her the use of her left arm. Friends who saw her in the aftermath described a woman struggling, for the first time in her adult life, with a body that would not do what she asked of it. The same body that had climbed a water tower at 6 years old, danced flamenco until dawn in Spain, water-skied through the night during the filming of The Night of the Iguana. She kept, throughout this decline, one habit she would not surrender: her wit. Friends recalled her, weakened and leaning against a tree during a walk in the park, laughing about how absurd it all was. That after everything, it had come to this. She was not asking for pity. She never really had. By 1988, Ava Gardner was living in her London flat, recovering as best she could from her stroke, her left arm still largely useless, one side of her face affected. She needed money. She had one asset left that felt, to her, like it still belonged entirely to her own hands. Her story. "I either write the book," she told a friend, "or sell the jewels." And she was, she added, rather sentimental about the jewels. On the recommendation of her friend, actor Dirk Bogarde, she brought in British journalist Peter Evans to ghostwrite her memoirs. For months, through in-person meetings and long late-night phone calls, she talked and he listened and transcribed. She resisted, often, being pushed to dwell on what she called her mistakes, the broken marriages, the men, the drinking, wanting instead to control which parts of her own life got emphasized. At one point she asked him directly why they couldn't simply settle for what she preferred to remember. "The publicity men at Metro used to do exactly that," she pointed out. Why couldn't he? Then she learned something that ended the entire collaboration. Frank Sinatra, her third husband and the great love of her life by her own repeated account, had once successfully sued Peter Evans for suggesting associations between Sinatra and organized crime. The moment she found out, the trust was gone. She fired him. The manuscript, unfinished, sat untouched. She completed her memoir a different way, with other writers, and Ava, My Story, went to press in 1990. But Evans's original conversations, the ones where she'd spoken most freely, in her own unfiltered voice, went into a drawer instead, unpublished, for over 2 decades. In January of 1990, after a second stroke, Sinatra, despite the fact that she could have covered the cost herself, arranged and paid for a medically staffed private plane to fly her to a specialist. It did not save her. On the 25th of January 1990, 1 month after her 67th birthday, Ava Gardner died in Westminster, London, of bronchopneumonia. 4 days later, she was buried in Smithfield, North Carolina, in Sunset Memorial Park, beside the parents who had raised her in a farmhouse with no indoor plumbing, in a town too small for most maps. She had always said she wanted to come home to be buried with her mother and father. At her funeral, one floral arrangement carried a note reading simply, "With love." She had left Grabtown in 1940 with a train ticket and a photograph she never asked anyone to take. She came home, finally, in a box. What remained, after Ava Gardner's death, split cleanly into 2 categories: the things that could be dispersed and the things that couldn't. Her estate went largely to family and to the people who had stayed loyal to her longest. Gregory Peck, her friend of over 4 decades and co-star in 3 films, took personal responsibility for both her housekeeper, Renee Jordan, and her dog, an act of loyalty that outlasted every marriage she had entered. Her possessions, gowns, photographs, and personal letters eventually made their way to a small museum being assembled by fans and local historians back home in Johnston County. Ava. My Story was published in 1990, only months after her death, telling her life largely on her own terms, in her own voice, filtered through the writers who helped complete what she and Peter Evans had started and abandoned. It became, in its own modest way, a bestseller, readers drawn to a woman who, even in her own retelling, never once claimed to be better than she was. But the real reckoning came 23 years later. In 2013, Peter Evans, who had died the year before, still holding the notes and tapes from those unfinished 1988 sessions, finally received permission from her estate to publish the raw material as Ava Gardner, The Secret Conversations. It captured her in a rawer, more unguarded register than the authorized memoir ever had. Crude, funny, self-deprecating, occasionally bitter about the men who'd used her and the studio that had underpaid her own confidence in herself for decades. It topped bestseller lists. It also confirmed, in her own words, private details, including the 2 abortions during her marriage to Sinatra, that had never previously been discussed publicly with this much candor. Remember the locked museum door from the very beginning of this video? Here, finally, is what it means. The museum that fans and historians built in her honor, in the same rural teacherage building where she'd once lived as a small child, sat there waiting for her, complete, catalogued, curated, and she chose, near the end of her life, not to walk through the door at all, not out of indifference, because she had already lived every object inside it. A museum can preserve a story. It cannot replace the person who actually survived it. The Ava Gardner Museum has operated in Smithfield, North Carolina, since the 1980s, drawing thousands of visitors a year who come specifically to see the life she was reluctant, at the very end, to walk back through herself. For decades, the popular version of Ava Gardner ran roughly like this: a beautiful, undisciplined woman who drank too much, married the wrong men, never took her own talent seriously, and burned through a fortune and 3 marriages without much reflection along the way. The Secret Conversations, published in 2013, complicated that story considerably, not by making her look better, but by making her look more specific, more self-aware, and considerably more clear-eyed about her own limitations and her own worth than the tabloid shorthand ever allowed. She knew precisely what she was and was not as an actress, she told people repeatedly, and refused false modesty as much as false grandeur. What the press and even some biographers called insecurity was, in fact, something closer to unusually blunt self-assessment, from a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told, by a studio system built on manufactured confidence, exactly what to think of herself. The detail that only emerged decades late, and that reframes almost everything else in this story, is small and devastating. A 15-year-old girl, watching her father die, going to beg a minister for comfort on his behalf, and being refused. Everything that followed, the drinking used to steady her nerves before a room full of strangers, the repeated pattern of loving damaged, brilliant men, and hoping this time someone would actually show up, the quiet loyalty she reserved for a housekeeper and a handful of true friends rather than the husbands who kept failing her, traces back to that one afternoon and that one absent minister more directly than any studio biography ever acknowledged. What the tabloids called a woman incapable of settling down was, in fact, a woman who had watched every institution meant to protect her, a farm, a school, a church, a marriage, dissolve or fail to show up when it mattered, and who kept searching anyway, past every disappointment, for the one that finally would. This is not a story about a Hollywood beauty who wasted her gifts. It is a story about a woman who spent her whole life being interpreted by other people, by a studio, by 3 husbands, by gossip columnists, by an unauthorized biography she couldn't stop before it happened. The one project that might have let her interpret herself in her own unfiltered voice while she was still alive to correct the record was the one project Frank Sinatra's old lawsuit accidentally destroyed. Return, for a moment, to that locked door in Smithfield, North Carolina. A woman in her 60s, recovering from a stroke, standing outside a museum built to honor a life that was, by then, mostly behind her. Someone offers to fetch the key. She waves it off. She already knows what's behind that door. The gowns, the photographs, the studio contracts, the 3 marriage licenses, the silent screen test that made her famous before anyone ever heard her actual voice. She lived every object in that building. She does not need to look at them again to prove that she did. That is the answer to the question this video opened with. How does a tenant farmer's daughter from a town too small for the map become one of the most photographed women alive? and still end up unwilling to walk through the door of her own museum. She becomes that woman precisely because everything inside that building was built by other people's interpretation of her: a studio's manufactured glamour, a husband's jealousy, a biographer's unfinished manuscript, a public that decided, before she ever spoke a word on camera, that she was terrific regardless of what she actually said. The one thing that building could never contain was the version of her that existed only in her own head, unphotographed, unedited, and, for most of her life, largely unheard. She built an extraordinary career, 60-some films across 5 decades, an Academy Award nomination, a permanent place in the mythology of Golden Age Hollywood, a face the American Film Institute would later rank among the greatest the screen has ever produced. And here is what it cost, in parallel, measured honestly rather than dramatically: a childhood cut short by fire and loss, 2 marriages that failed inside 2 years each, 2 children she chose not to have, a 3rd marriage that consumed and defined the rest of her emotional life without ever being repaired, a body broken by one lover, and a will nearly broken by grief for a mother she lost the same day her first marriage ended, and a final honest account of her own life that reached the public only after both she and the man who tried to help her tell it were already gone. She got the fame. She never fully got to narrate it herself while she was alive to be believed. The jewels, in the end, she kept. The book, the real one, arrived 23 years too late for her to read what people finally understood.